Chapter 3. Impossible Recovery. The simulator, Bay, hummed with the quiet efficiency of early morning. Lieutenant Robert Maestro Terwilliger arrived precisely 7 minutes before his scheduled session, as he always did. The room was empty, except for Major Dagger Davis, who sat at the observer's station reviewing flight data on her tablet with unwavering focus, her silhouette sharp against the blue glow of the monitors. Maestro approached with measured steps, his posture impeccable. "Good morning, Major Davis." Dagger looked up, her dark eyes assessing him with characteristic precision. "Lieutenant Terwilliger." She set her tablet aside with a deliberate motion. "Your formation work yesterday showed improvement. Your spacing was consistent to within 0.3 meters throughout the exercise." "Thank you, Major." Maestro's expression remained neutral, though the faintest hint of pride flickered across his features like distant lightning. "I've been applying the dimensional visualization technique you suggested." "I noticed." Dagger stood, her movements economical as a predator conserving energy. "Your turns are still too mechanical. You're calculating each adjustment rather than feeling the aircraft's response." "With respect, Major, calculation ensures precision." Maestro's fingers adjusted his collar with mathematical exactitude. "It ensures predictability," she corrected, her voice cutting through the air like a perfectly honed blade. "There's a difference. Predictable pilots make predictable targets." Maestro tilted his head slightly, processing this distinction. "My grandfather always maintained that predictability was the foundation of excellence in aviation." "Your grandfather was an exceptional pilot," Dagger acknowledged, her posture shifting almost imperceptibly. "But even he understood that mathematics alone doesn't make a complete aviator. The sky doesn't follow equations." A flicker of surprise crossed Maestro's face. "You knew my grandfather?" "I studied under him briefly." Dagger's expression revealed nothing more, her features composed as a carved monument. "Today's exercise will focus on a different aspect of your training. I've prepared 17 different emergency response frameworks based on statistical probability models," Maestro said, his long fingers adjusting the cuffs of his flight suit with geometric precision. The corner of Dagger's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but the molecular precursor to one. "We'll see if any of them matter when everything falls apart." As Maestro settled into the simulator, his movements were fluid and practiced. Each switch and control was checked in a precise sequence that never varied. Dagger watched him with the focused attention of a falcon, missing nothing. "Your technical mastery is impressive, Lieutenant," she said, her voice carrying easily across the quiet room. "But today we're testing something beyond technique." Maestro's hands paused momentarily over the controls. "May I ask what specifically?" "No." Dagger moved to the instructor's station, the morning light catching the insignia on her uniform. "Sometimes the test finds you before you know what's being tested. Commencing scenario in 3, 2, 1. The simulator pitched violently as Maestro found himself at 30,000 feet with warning lights immediately cascading across the panel like a crimson waterfall. Engine fire warnings blared, followed by hydraulic pressure loss indicators. The stick went slack in his hand as the flight control systems failed in rapid succession. Maestro's eyes narrowed, his hands moving with preternatural speed as he worked through emergency checklists. "Interesting," he murmured. "Engine fire coupled with complete hydraulic failure and electrical system cascade beginning." His fingers danced across the controls, attempting to isolate systems and contain the failures. The mathematical patterns of the emergency revealed themselves to him like constellations, beautiful, complex, and utterly dire. "This is a non-standard failure pattern," he observed clinically. "The probability of simultaneous primary and backup hydraulic system failure coupled with electrical degradation is approximately 0.00003%. The simulator continued its death spiral, more systems failing with each passing second. The horizon spun in the view screen, Earth and sky trading places in a dizzying waltz. Maestro's calculations accelerated, his mind processing failure trajectories and recovery options at quantum speeds. After exactly 47 seconds, His hands went still on the controls. He turned toward the observation window, his expression unchanged. "This scenario is mathematically unsolvable, Major," he stated with absolute certainty. "The cascading failures create a deterministic outcome. There are precisely 0 recovery paths that result in continued flight." Dagger remained seated, watching him with unnerving stillness. Her dark eyes revealed nothing as they reflected the emergency lights pulsing from the simulator. "The point isn't to solve it, Terwilliger," she said quietly. "The point is what you do when you can't." Maestro blinked, a rare display of surprise. "I don't understand. If recovery is impossible, then the exercise is—" "Is what?" Dagger interrupted, her voice still soft but carrying an edge sharp enough to cut through steel. "Pointless? Unfair?" She leaned forward slightly, her shadow stretching across the console. "The sky doesn't care about fair, Lieutenant. Neither does gravity." Maestro's perfect posture faltered almost imperceptibly. "There are 14,605 ways this maneuver could fail," he said, echoing his typical analysis. "And 0 ways it could succeed." "Then what remains?" Dagger asked, rising from her seat in one fluid motion. The question hung in the air between them like smoke. Maestro stared at the failing systems, his mind recalibrating. "I was over the South China Sea," Dagger said suddenly, her voice taking on a distant quality that Maestro had never heard before. "Triple-engine failure in weather conditions that shouldn't have existed according to all meteorological models. No recovery possible." Maestro turned to her, genuinely curious. "What did you do?" "I stopped trying to save the aircraft," she said simply, her silhouette stark against the window, "and started focusing on what could be saved." Something shifted in Maestro's expression, a subtle realignment of his understanding, like tumblers falling into place in a complex lock. He turned back to the controls, his approach visibly changing. Instead of fighting the inevitable descent, he began working with it, adjusting the glide path using the minimal control surfaces that still responded. "If I accept the loss of the aircraft as inevitable," he said, thinking aloud, "I can redirect my calculations toward maximizing survival probability." His hands moved with renewed purpose, no longer attempting to recover the unrecoverable, but managing the descent with exquisite precision. He calculated glide ratios, identified potential landing zones from the simulator's terrain data, and positioned the dying aircraft for optimal impact angles. "Interesting," he murmured, a new light in his eyes. "By accepting certain failures as inevitable, I create space for alternative approaches that weren't visible within my recovery frameworks." The simulator continued its descent, but now with a strange grace, like a mortally wounded bird finding one last moment of beauty in flight. Maestro guided it toward a stretch of terrain that offered the highest survival probability, using the aircraft's momentum and the last vestiges of control to position for impact. Through the view screen, the ground rushed up to meet him, a patchwork of forest and clearing that transformed from abstract pattern to immediate reality with terrifying speed. Maestro's hands remained steady, making micro-adjustments that shaved precious degrees from the impact angle. When the simulator finally went dark, indicating a crash landing, Maestro sat motionless, processing what had just occurred. The sudden silence was deafening after the cacophony of alarms. "Survival probability for pilot, 64.3%, he calculated aloud. Not optimal, but significantly above the 0% baseline of continued flight attempts. Dagger stood, her movement so fluid it seemed she simply materialized at his side. For the briefest moment, so brief Maestro almost missed it, a smile crossed her face, transforming her features like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "Now you're thinking like a warrior, not just a pilot," she said, her voice carrying a new note of respect. Maestro tilted his head slightly. "I failed to save the aircraft." "Yes," Dagger agreed, the morning light casting half her face in shadow. "And in accepting that failure, you found success elsewhere." She tapped the simulator canopy once, the sound sharp and final. "Perfect flight records make for impressive statistics, Lieutenant. but it's how you handle impossible situations that determines whether you return to create those statistics. She turned to leave, then paused, her profile etched against the light from the doorway. The difference between a good pilot and a great one isn't found in how they handle success, she said, her voice carrying the weight of experience. It's in how they navigate failure. As Dagger walked away, her footsteps perfectly measured, Maestro remained in the simulator, his mind racing through new dimensions of understanding. For the first time, he found himself calculating not just the mathematics of flight, but the geometry of survival, and discovering that sometimes the perfect solution wasn't about winning, but about redefining what victory meant. The simulator bay fell silent again, but something had changed in the space between them, an understanding that transcended words, hanging in the air like the afterimage of lightning. Chapter 4. Storm's Gambit. Rook had always approached flying the way she approached chess, with strategy, foresight, and a clear understanding that every move had consequences. 3 steps ahead was her minimum, 5 was preferable. In the air as on the board, she saw patterns where others saw chaos. The morning dawned with the kind of perfect clarity that pilots dream about. The Texas sky stretched endless and blue, unmarred by clouds, with visibility that seemed to extend to the curve of the Earth itself. As Rook completed her pre-flight checks on the T-38 Talon, her movements were methodical, each item on the checklist receiving the same careful attention regardless of its significance. "Perfect day for the canyon run," Major Dagger Davis observed, materializing beside the aircraft with characteristic silence. Her voice carried that distinctive precision that made even casual comments sound like military directives. She stood with perfect posture, clipboard in hand, her dark eyes missing nothing. "Yes, ma'am," Rook replied, her own posture straightening instinctively in Dagger's presence. "Weather conditions are optimal." "Optimal is irrelevant," Dagger said, her gaze cutting through Rook like a laser sight. "Nature doesn't care about your forecasts or preparation. This exercise isn't about flying in perfect conditions. It's about decision-making when everything goes wrong." Dagger circled the aircraft, her movements economical, predatory. The canyon creates its own weather patterns. Downdrafts, thermal pockets, unexpected turbulence. Your ability to calculate risk in real time will be tested. Rook nodded, absorbing the information with the same focus she applied to studying a new chess opening. "I've reviewed the topographical maps and wind patterns for the area. I've identified the primary risk zones and planned alternative routes." A ghost of a smile touched Dagger's lips, there and gone like lightning. Planning is essential. Adaptation is survival. She made a note on her clipboard with surgical precision. "You'll be flying solo today. I'll be monitoring from the chase plane." "Understood, Major." Rook completed her final checks, her movements fluid yet precise. "One more thing, Lieutenant," Dagger said, her voice dropping slightly. "Lieutenant Thornberry completed this course yesterday." The unspoken challenge hung in the air between them. Rook met Dagger's gaze directly. "I'm aware, ma'am. He took some creative liberties with the route." "I won't need to," Rook replied with quiet confidence. Dagger's expression remained unreadable, but something flickered in her eyes. Approval, perhaps, or curiosity. "We'll see." 20 minutes later, Rook was airborne, the T-38 climbing through 10,000 feet with smooth precision. The aircraft responded to her touch like an extension of her body, each adjustment minute but purposeful. Below, the Texas landscape unfolded in a patchwork of greens and browns, geometric patterns of farmland giving way to the more chaotic textures of undeveloped terrain. "Talon 3, this is Chase. Maintain heading 270, proceed to waypoint Alpha," Dagger's voice came through the radio, clear and crisp. "Chase, Talon 3. "Roger that," Rook acknowledged, banking the aircraft into a gentle turn that aligned her with the western heading. As she leveled off at 15,000 feet, Rook felt the familiar sense of liberation that came with flight. On the ground, The world was full of constraints, regulations, expectations, the constant pressure to prove herself in a field still dominated by men. But in the air, those constraints fell away. Here, physics was the only law that truly mattered, and physics didn't care about gender or background, only about the correct application of principles. The canyon system appeared on the horizon, a jagged wound in the Earth's surface that stretched for miles. Unlike the Grand Canyon's vast expanse, this was a network of narrower cuts, some barely wide enough for the T-38 to navigate safely. It was a natural labyrinth of stone and shadow, with walls that rose hundreds of feet from the canyon floor and created their own microclimate. Talon 3, you are cleared to descend to 8,000 feet and begin the canyon approach, Dagger instructed, her voice carrying the same intensity whether she was ordering coffee or directing combat operations. Remember your training. This isn't about speed. It's about precision and decision-making. Roger that, Chase, Rook replied, easing the nose down and beginning a controlled descent. As the altimeter unwound, the canyon details became more distinct. Rook could see the play of light and shadow across the striated rock faces, the occasional flash of green where vegetation had found purchase in seemingly impossible places. The beauty was undeniable, but so was the danger. These walls wouldn't forgive miscalculation. At 8,000 feet, Rook leveled off and began her approach to the canyon entrance. The T-38's engines hummed with restrained power, ready to respond to her commands. She felt the first hint of turbulence as she crossed the threshold, where open terrain gave way to the canyon's influence, like crossing an invisible boundary into another world. "Entering canyon system," she reported, her voice calm despite the quickening of her pulse. "Maintaining 8,000 feet, airspeed 300 knots. The canyon walls rose on either side, their proximity creating a heightened sense of speed. Sunlight sliced through the gap above, creating alternating patterns of brilliance and shadow that the aircraft passed through like a silver needle threading its way through a complex tapestry. The rock faces were a geological timeline, layers of red, gold, and amber telling a story millions of years in the making. Rook's eyes constantly scanned her instruments, the terrain ahead, and the navigational markers on her display. The first segment was relatively straightforward, a wide section with gentle curves that allowed her to establish a rhythm and feel for the canyon's character. Approaching first decision point, Dagger noted from the chase plane, which maintained position high above the canyon. Wind shear reported at the junction. Calculate your approach. Ahead, the canyon split into two branches, one continuing west, the other veering northwest. The western route was wider, but required a more significant altitude adjustment due to rising terrain. The northwestern route was narrower, but maintained a more consistent elevation profile. In chess, this would be the moment to evaluate multiple possible moves and their consequences. Rook processed the variables, wind conditions, aircraft performance parameters, terrain features, and made her decision. Taking the northwest route, she reported, banking the aircraft into a precise turn that aligned her with the narrower passage. Maintaining current altitude, reducing airspeed to 280 knots to compensate for reduced maneuvering space. "Bold choice," Dagger commented, her tone revealing nothing about whether she approved. "Thornberry chose the western route." "Different pilots, different strategies," Rook replied, her focus unwavering. As she entered the narrower section, the canyon walls seemed to close in around her. The T-38's wingtips were now less than 100 feet from the rock face on either side, close enough that the texture of the stone was clearly visible, the stratified layers like pages in an ancient book. The first hint of trouble came as a subtle vibration through the control stick, a warning that the air currents were becoming more complex. Rook felt the aircraft wanting to drift toward the eastern wall, the invisible hand of a crosswind pushing against her carefully planned trajectory. "Encountering stronger than forecast crosswinds," she reported, making minute adjustments to maintain her centerline position. "Compensating." "Noted," Dagger replied, her voice as steady as if she were discussing the weather over coffee. "The canyon creates its own weather. What's your assessment of continuing on this route? Rook quickly recalculated. The crosswind was stronger than expected, but still within manageable parameters. The alternative, backtracking to take the western route, would burn additional fuel and time. Risk versus reward, a constant equation in both chess and aviation. Continuing northwest route, she decided. Crosswind is manageable with current control inputs. Benefit outweighs the risk. Interesting, Dagger said, the word carrying layers of meaning. Most pilots would revert to the safer option. I'm not most pilots, Major. The canyon narrowed further, the walls now rising almost vertically on either side. Sunlight reached the canyon floor only at midday, creating a dramatic interplay of light and shadow. The T-38 sliced through patches of brilliance and darkness, the transitions momentarily disorienting before Rook's eyes adjusted. Then came the downdraft, a sudden, powerful current of descending air that pushed the aircraft toward the canyon floor with alarming force. The altimeter began unwinding rapidly, 8,000 feet becoming 7,800, then 7,600 in seconds. Encountering significant downdraft, Rook reported, her voice still controlled despite the surge of adrenaline. She increased power and adjusted the aircraft's attitude, fighting against the invisible force that seemed determined to push her downward. This is a known phenomenon at this junction, Dagger replied, her tone unchanged. The temperature differential between the canyon rim and floor creates powerful vertical currents. What's your decision, Lieutenant? The T-38 continued to lose altitude despite Rook's countermeasures. 7,400 feet. 7,200 feet. The canyon floor was approximately 6,500 feet above sea level at this point. The margin for error was shrinking rapidly. In chess, there were moments when the planned strategy had to be abandoned in favor of tactical necessity. This was such a moment. Executing emergency climb, Rook announced, pushing the throttles to maximum and pulling back on the stick with calculated force. The T-38 responded immediately, its powerful engines driving it upward against the downdraft. The G-forces pressed Rook back into her seat as the aircraft's nose pitched upward. The canyon walls blurred in her peripheral vision as she focused on her instruments, watching the altimeter begin to climb again. 7,300 feet. 7,500 feet. But the maneuver had consequences. The emergency climb had positioned the aircraft at an awkward angle relative to the canyon's path, which curved to the right ahead. The T-38 was now drifting toward the eastern wall, the distance closing more rapidly than was comfortable. Correcting, Rook stated, rolling the aircraft to align with the canyon's curve while maintaining her climb. It was a complex three-dimensional adjustment that required precise coordination of multiple control inputs. For a heart-stopping moment, the eastern wall loomed large in her side window, close enough that she could distinguish individual features in the rock face, a jutting outcrop, a dark crevice, the subtle variations in color that marked different mineral compositions. Then the aircraft responded to her commands, banking away from the wall and threading the needle of the canyon's path. Well executed, Lieutenant, Dagger commented, her voice carrying the faintest hint of approval, like finding a single drop of water in the desert. Thornberry would have barrel-rolled between the walls. Your approach was more elegant. Chess teaches patience, Major. Sometimes the direct approach isn't the best one. Interesting perspective, Dagger replied. You've reached the halfway point. The canyon widens ahead, but be advised of potential thermal activity due to the changing terrain profile. As predicted, the canyon began to broaden, the walls receding to create a more expansive space. Rook allowed herself a moment to appreciate the vista that opened before her, a cathedral of stone sculpted by wind and water over millennia. Shafts of sunlight penetrated to the canyon floor, illuminating patches of vegetation that added splashes of green to the predominantly red and amber palette of the rock. The wider space allowed Rook to climb to a more comfortable altitude, establishing 9,000 feet as her new cruising level. The air here was smoother, the violent downdrafts replaced by gentler thermal currents that the T-38 rode with ease. Beginning final segment, Rook reported, her confidence building as she navigated the more forgiving terrain. The canyon's exit was visible ahead, a bright opening where the stone walls gave way to open sky. "Be advised, Talon 3, Dagger's voice came through with unexpected urgency. "Weather alert from base. Isolated thunderstorm developing rapidly near the canyon exit. Recommend immediate diversion to alternate route." Rook processed this new information quickly. The storm hadn't been on the forecast, a reminder that nature didn't always follow predictions. The alternate route would take her south through a subsidiary canyon, adding 15 minutes to her flight time, but avoiding the developing weather system. She was about to acknowledge the instruction when she noticed something on her weather radar. A gap in the storm cell, a narrow corridor of clear air that might allow direct passage. It was risky, certainly, but potentially manageable with precise navigation. In chess, the winning move was sometimes the one your opponent didn't expect, the calculated risk that changed the game's dynamics. "Request permission to attempt direct exit through the southern edge of the storm cell," Rook said, her voice steady. "Radar shows a navigable corridor with minimal precipitation." There was a pause before Dagger responded. "That's a significant risk, Lieutenant. The storm is still developing. Conditions could change rapidly." "Acknowledged," Rook replied. "But I've calculated the approach. With current aircraft performance and the observed storm movement, I estimate an 80% probability of successful transit. The alternative route carries its own risks due to potential fuel constraints if the storm expands further." Another pause, longer this time. Rook could almost feel Dagger weighing the variables, conducting her own risk assessment. "Permission granted, Talon 3, Dagger finally responded. "But be prepared to abort and divert at the first sign of deteriorating conditions. This is your decision. Own it." "Understood, Chase, proceeding with direct exit approach." As Rook approached the canyon's mouth, the sky ahead transformed from clear blue to a complex tapestry of cloud formations. The thunderstorm was building to the north, its anvil-shaped top spreading across the sky like an ominous canopy. But to the south, as her radar had indicated, there was a gap, a corridor of relatively clear air between the storm's main body and a smaller cell that was developing independently. Rook adjusted her course, aiming for this meteorological doorway. The T-38 responded crisply, its sleek form slicing through the increasingly turbulent air with controlled power. The first raindrops struck the canopy as she reached the canyon exit, fat droplets that streaked across the plexiglass before being swept away by the airflow. "Exiting canyon, entering weather system perimeter," she reported. "Visibility still good, moderate turbulence." "Thornberry would have flown straight through the heart of the storm," Dagger commented, her voice carrying a note of curiosity, claiming he could feel his way through. "Different approaches, same objective," Rook replied. "I prefer to calculate my risks rather than feel them." "Both approaches have their place," Dagger said, surprising Rook with what almost sounded like philosophical reflection. "The question is knowing when to apply each." The contrast between the canyon's confined space and the vast, dynamic environment of the storm was striking. Where the canyon had been all solid boundaries and defined spaces, the storm was fluid, constantly changing, its borders undefined. The light changed too, the bright sunshine giving way to a diffuse grey illumination that flattened perspectives and muted colours. Rook maintained her focus, eyes constantly scanning between instruments and the visual reference points outside. The corridor she'd identified was holding, but the edges were becoming less distinct as the storm cells evolved. Lightning flashed in the distance, momentarily illuminating the dark heart of the main storm cell. The turbulence increased as she penetrated deeper into the corridor, the T-38 bucking and rolling in the disturbed air. Rook made continuous small adjustments, keeping the aircraft stable while maintaining her course through the narrowing gap. "Storm cells are converging more rapidly than forecast," Dagger warned from the chase plane, which was maintaining position well above the weather. "Your exit window is closing, Lieutenant. Decision point approaching." Rook assessed the situation with the same cool calculation she applied to a challenging chess position. The corridor was indeed narrowing, but her position relative to it remained favourable. The T-38 had the performance capabilities to accelerate through the remaining gap before it closed completely. The risk was increasing, but still within acceptable parameters. Continuing on current course, she decided. Increasing speed to transit the corridor before convergence. Estimated clearance in 45 seconds. She pushed the throttles forward, feeling the aircraft surge in response. The airspeed indicator climbed rapidly. 350 knots, 400, 450. The turbulence made the higher speed more challenging to manage. Each gust and eddy translated into more pronounced movements of the aircraft. Rain was now falling heavily, drumming against the canopy and reducing visibility. The edges of the corridor were becoming indistinct, defined more by the aircraft's radar than by visual references. Lightning flashed again, closer this time. The accompanying thunder audible even over the roar of the engines. 30 seconds to clearance, Rook reported, her voice tight with concentration. The T-38 was performing beautifully, responding to her inputs with precision despite the challenging conditions. This was what the aircraft was built for. Performance under pressure. The corridor continued to narrow, the storm cells on either side reaching toward each other like massive hands about to clap. Rook held her course, making minute adjustments to thread the ever-shrinking needle between them. 15 seconds to clearance. A flash of lightning struck directly ahead, momentarily blinding her. The thunder was instantaneous, a physical force that seemed to shake the aircraft. For a split second, Rook flew blind, relying entirely on her instruments and the muscle memory developed through countless hours of training. When her vision cleared, she saw that the corridor had all but disappeared. The storm cells had merged ahead, creating a wall of cloud and precipitation that blocked her planned exit route. In chess, when your primary strategy is blocked, you don't panic, you adapt. You find the next best move based on the new board configuration. Executing contingency plan, Rook announced, banking the aircraft sharply to the south where her radar showed a thinner section of the storm cell. Diverting to secondary exit route. The T-38 responded to her commands, rolling into a steep turn that reoriented it toward the new escape path. The G-forces pressed Rook against the side of her seat as she maintained the turn, precise and controlled despite the turbulence that threatened to destabilize the aircraft. Good decision, Lieutenant, Dagger acknowledged, and for once her approval was unmistakable. The primary corridor is now completely closed. Your situational awareness is commendable. In chess, you learn to see the whole board, Rook replied, and to always have a contingency when your opponent makes an unexpected move. Nature is the ultimate opponent, Dagger said. It doesn't play by any rules. The new route took Rook through the thinnest part of the southern storm cell, still turbulent and rain-filled, but navigable. The T-38 bucked and shuddered as it encountered the disturbed air, but Rook maintained control, her hands making constant small adjustments to the stick and throttle. Visibility reduced to mere hundreds of feet as she entered the cloud layer, the world outside the canopy transforming into a grey void occasionally illuminated by distant lightning. In these conditions, the instruments became her primary reality. Airspeed, altitude, attitude, heading. The physical sensations of flight could be misleading. The instruments told the truth. Maintaining course through southern cell, she reported. Instruments indicate approximately 2 minutes to clear air. Thornberry would say you're flying too mechanically, Dagger commented, her voice carrying an edge of challenge. That you're not feeling the aircraft. With respect, Major, Rook replied, her concentration unwavering. I don't need to feel the aircraft when I can read it. The instruments don't lie. Both approaches have merit, Dagger said. The best pilots know when to trust their instruments and when to trust their instincts. Those 2 minutes stretched like hours as Rook navigated through the heart of the storm. Rain lashed the canopy in sheets, driven by winds that buffeted the aircraft from all directions. Occasional downdrafts caused momentary altitude losses that required immediate correction. The T-38 was designed for performance, not comfort, and it transmitted every atmospheric disturbance directly to the pilot. But Rook remained centered, her mind clear despite the chaos around her. Each challenge was met with calculated response, each deviation corrected with precise input. The chess player's mentality, seeing patterns, anticipating developments, maintaining strategic awareness even in tactical complexity. Then, almost suddenly, the grey void began to lighten. The rain thinned, the turbulence eased, and patches of blue became visible through breaks in the cloud layer. Rook had reached the storm's southern boundary. "Emerging from weather system," she reported, a note of satisfaction creeping into her voice despite her professional demeanour. "Conditions improving rapidly. Clear air ahead." As the T-38 burst from the final layer of clouds into open sky, the contrast was startling. Behind her, the storm continued to build, a dark, turbulent mass that now completely engulfed the canyon exit. Ahead, the sky was clear blue, the sun bright and welcoming. The aircraft, as if sharing her relief, seemed to fly more smoothly in the undisturbed air. "Well navigated, Talon 3, Dagger commented, her voice carrying that rare note of approval that was more valuable than effusive praise from anyone else. "Your risk assessment was accurate, and your execution was precise. When conditions changed, you adapted without hesitation." "Thank you, Chase," Rook replied, allowing herself a small smile now that the challenge had been met. "Request vectors for return to base." "Proceed heading 090, maintain 15,000 feet, Dagger instructed. "And Lieutenant?" That was exceptional flying. As Rook banked the T-38 toward the east, setting course for home, she felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond simply completing the mission. She had faced a complex dynamic challenge and navigated it successfully through a combination of preparation, calculation, and adaptation. In the air, as in chess, the key to success wasn't avoiding risk. It was calculating it correctly and having the skill to execute when it mattered most. Today, she had proven to herself and to Major Davis that she possessed both. The T-38 gleamed in the sunlight as it cruised above the Texas landscape, a silver arrow against the blue canvas of the sky. Rook settled into the rhythm of straight and level flight, appreciating the aircraft's response to her touch. Not just a machine, but a partner in this aerial dance. Chess was played on a board with defined boundaries and pieces that moved according to fixed rules. Flying, she reflected, was chess in 3 dimensions, with rules that could change mid-game. The complexity made the victory all the sweeter. As the base appeared on the horizon, Rook began her descent with the same precision that had characterized her entire flight. The lesson had been learned, not just intellectually, but viscerally. In aviation, as in life, the calculated risk, taken with preparation, executed with skill, and adapted when necessary, was often the path to success. And sometimes, the most beautiful flying happened not in perfect conditions, but when navigating through the storm.